All right, welcome everyone. We're just going to give it a few more minutes for people to join the call today. All right, I can see that people are still joining the meeting, but we've got a lot of ground to cover today, so I think I'm going to get started. So my name is Rebecca Penz. I'm a director with the Planning and Land Use Management branch within the Ministry of Housing. I hope all of you are staying warm and dry today. I'm calling in from blustery Victoria, which is on the territory of the Lekwungen speaking people known today as the Esquimalt Nation and the Songhees Nation. And it's with extreme gratitude for their care of the land and for allowing us to join today from their territories. We have a panel of experts here today to present information and to respond to your questions. We also have a few people off sick, and so we may need a little bit of grace to respond to some of your questions that might be from some of our experts who are off today. But I'm going to introduce our panel. So from the Integrated Development Branch of the Ministry of Transportation and Infrastructure, we have Shannon Price, the Executive Director, Clarence Lai, Director, Teresa O'Donnell, Senior Advisor with MODI, who's supporting in the transit-oriented area legislation. And then from the Planning and Land Use Branch of the Ministry of Housing, we have Jessica Brooks, Executive Director, Mark Sadaway, who is a manager and your presenter today, and John Gamey, Senior Policy Analyst. So a couple of housekeeping items before we get started. We have been updating the webinar page and have been posting recordings and presentations from the previous webinars, so I encourage you to go back and take a look for those. We will also be posting FAQs that have emerged from this webinar series and other resources on our web pages, so please sign up to those pages. You will get notified when we've added new content and new resources. There are many of you here, and I can see the numbers continue to increase, but there's over 300 at this point in time. So just wanting to make the most use of your time, we have opted for this webinar format so that we can get as many questions answered as possible. Throughout the presentation, you can enter your questions in the Q&A function, and I see that some of you have figured that out already, and you can upvote those questions. Following the approximately 30 to 40 minute presentation, we will begin answering questions, prioritizing those questions with the most upvotes. The focus today is on the technical requirements for designating the TOAs. So I ask that your questions really focus on those requirements. We won't be repeating questions that have been asked and answered already. All right, with that in mind, I will ask that we go to the next slide and turn it over to Mark. Thank you, Mark.
Okay, thank you very much, Rebecca, and thank you again to everyone who is attending and you taking time out of your day to join us for this webinar. So it's much appreciated. So you're on this webinar because it's likely you either work for a local government or work with the local government, and you therefore have a role to play in implementing the legislative requirements and changes related to Bill 47 and transit-oriented areas. So the goal of the webinar is to provide information so you can better understand the changes and implementation requirements. So I'll be covering off what transit-oriented areas are, how the minimum allowable density framework works, what it is, and how it applies in transit-oriented areas. Requirements related to regulating parking provision in transit-oriented areas, and we'll be discussing a bit about the provincial policy manual for transit-oriented areas and what it's used for. And we'll also talk a bit about the implementation of the legislation and some other considerations that specific to local government implementation and the new requirements. So the legislation, Bill 47, was passed in November and is now largely in effect. And the reason for the legislation was to move towards fulfilling and addressing a number of provincial goals simultaneously, and those include providing more affordable housing supply, better integrating transportation and land use, providing more alternatives to traveling by motor vehicle, reducing emissions from transportation, and maximizing infrastructure investment. These changes are intended to support the creation of complete communities around our busy transit hubs in British Columbia. These communities not only increase housing supply, but also play a role in reducing emissions by capitalizing on reduced car dependency and supporting active transportation. And the changes are also intended to support maximizing the return on government investment in public transit systems and services. So together, the density, mix, and pattern of land uses around transit hubs will create transit supportive conditions necessary for transit-oriented areas, or TOAs, to thrive. Next slide. So Bill 47 and transit-oriented areas is a number of things. It is changes, statutory changes, so amendments to statute, including the Local Government Act and Vancouver Charter, in order to incorporate the transit-oriented area legislative requirements and provisions. There were some consequential amendments to the Islands Trust Act and the Transportation Act. They were also passed as part of the changes. There were also several regulations that were implemented with the statute changes. So these regulations essentially give effect to the legislation and provide some of the details about how the legislation is intended to work. And that includes a regulation that designates 52 interim transit-oriented areas that took effect as of December 7th, 2023. The regulations also list the transit stations, what you'll see in the statute is the prescribed transit stations around which local governments must designate transit-oriented areas by June 30th, 2024. And finally, they set out the other details related to the legislative framework. So that includes the minimum allowable density and height, and the applicable distances in terms of designating transit-oriented areas. And the final piece is the introduction of a provincial policy manual. So in the statute, it's referred to as provincial policy guidelines, but we just use the term manual for simplicity. And I'll speak a bit more about that in greater detail later on in the presentation. Next slide. So just first up, we wanted to really focus on sort of the short-term requirements here. So there's some requirements of local governments by June 30th, 2024. And this slide just provides some information on that. So first, local governments must designate transit-oriented areas around prescribed transit stations by bylaw by June 30th, 2024. So June 30th of this year. It's actually not, I should add, it's not on the slide, but it does not have to, the legislation is silent on the type of bylaw. It does not have to be an OCP amendment. It does not have to be a zoning bylaw. It's just by bylaw by June 30th, 2024. A couple of notes under this. In some cases, the transit station may fall outside of a particular municipality's boundary, but because of the prescribed distance, the transit-oriented area extends into that municipality. So in these cases, that particular municipality will be responsible for designating that portion of the TOA that's within their boundaries. And the critical thing here is that the list of stations for this is in Order in Council 678 2023. And you can find that. So there's a link in the chat box in the chat box for our Zoom webinar here. But also you can find that on the Local Government Housing Initiative's website and navigate to the page for transit-oriented areas. And this website, if you haven't been there yet, I encourage you to take a look. It's where we're putting all of the summary of how this works, the materials, links that are relevant, particularly for local governments on this site. And as Rebecca mentioned, you can sign up for updates. So plug in your email address and you'll be notified if there's any changes or updates to pages on this website. So in addition to transit-oriented area designation, local governments are also required to update their parking regulation bylaws to conform with the legislative requirements with regard to off-street residential parking within TOAs by June 30th. And there will be more information. I'll talk a bit more about that a little bit later in the presentation. Next slide, please. So what is a transit-oriented area, TOA? The statute defines a transit-oriented area as land that is within 800 meters of a prescribed passenger rail station. So passenger rail station that is listed in the regulation, and basically passenger rail station means SkyTrain station that is listed in the regulation. It lands within 400 meters of a bus exchange or a West Coast Express station that is prescribed in the regulation. And these distances are measured in sort of crow flies distances, so directly from the coordinate to an outer perimeter of either 400 or 800 meters, depending on the station type. And I should point out that the OIC 678 has the name of the station. So it has a chart that has the name of the station, the type of station, and the coordinates to facilitate identifying the center point from which to measure. And it's important to stress that the legislative requirements related to TOAs only apply within TOAs. They do not apply outside. And we've already been over this, but there's a requirement that local governments designate them by bylaw by June 30th. There's also a requirement in the legislation to notify the Minister of Transportation and Infrastructure of bylaw adoption, so that the ministry is aware, and the suggested pathway for doing that is to send those materials by email to the email address that's shown on screen there. Next slide, please. And pardon me, I've just lost my cursor here so I can scroll. There we go. Okay, so this is just a sample or an example of a TOA designation, just for our reference here. And the key things I'd just like to highlight are the little icon at the center is with the little train symbol is the location of the prescribed transit station. And then the dashed outline around the perimeter of the shaded area is the designation of the transit-oriented area. So that would be drawn at a distance of 800 meters from the station. And I'll come back to this illustration to go into a bit more about what the various other circles and colors mean. Next slide, please. So as I noted earlier, effective December 7th, the province designated 52 transit-oriented areas where the legislative framework for Bill 47 is currently in effect. So this information is online as well. You don't have to look at this. This is just to illustrate that it's already in effect for these particular municipalities in these particular station areas. And this only affects the locations that are listed here. Effective June 30th, all prescribed transit stations will be in effect, including those designated by the province, so the previous 52, plus additional transit stations will need to be designated by local governments. So this slide lists all the municipalities that will be required to designate TOAs effective June 30th. And I'll just point out there's a few that have a little asterisk next to them. Those are because of the jurisdictional overlap. And it's because the station that's prescribed in the regulations located in an adjacent municipality. Next slide, please. And this is just to show this quickly is a good example of that. So in this case, Coquitlam Station is located within Coquitlam, but that 800-meter radius extends into a portion of Burnaby. So Burnaby would designate that remaining portion that is within their boundaries. Within the legislative framework, there are circumstances where the province designates transit-oriented areas. So again, as noted earlier, the province has already established 52 of the interim transit-oriented area designations that were in effect as of December 7th. These cease to have effect when the local government's bylaw designates those areas and takes effect. So when a municipality develops their TOA designation bylaw and adopts their bylaw for the same area as one of the areas that were designated as an interim area, the interim designation ceases to have effect, and the local bylaw is now giving effect to that particular transit-oriented area. In addition to the interim designations, if the province doesn't receive notice of the adoption of the TOA designation bylaw, or if a designation was made incorrectly, the Minister of Transportation Infrastructure may provide notice to that particular local government that identifies the TOA, the reasons the minister may recommend an order in council, and minimum 90-day compliance time frame. That gives the municipality time to realign their bylaw. And if needed, the Lieutenant Governor and Council may make an order designating the TOA on the recommendation of the Minister of Transportation and Infrastructure. Next slide, please. So is this a static list of stations? No, it isn't. We anticipate that that new stations will be designated in the future. So new stations will be identified when planned transit lines and systems have reached a point in time in terms of their planning process where there's certainty they will be constructed. If that happens, the regulations may be amended to include that new transit station. And if that were the case, that would trigger a requirement to update the transit-oriented area designation bylaws. So there's several considerations in terms of identifying those future stations, status of planning, funding and construction, that type of thing, in order to assess the certainty of that station. But of course, sort of joint communications and coordination and planning activities between municipalities, local governments, the province and BC Transit and TransLink are going to continue to be critical in the process of making changes to the regulations in the future. So now that we've talked about transit-oriented areas, what happens in transit-oriented areas? So this is the section of the presentation that discusses three things. The minimum allowable density, so that local governments may not deny rezoning applications based solely on the level of density or height that's proposed if it is at or below the density and height set out in the regulations. May not require provision of off-street residential parking spaces in TOAs. And then requirements to consider the provincial policy manual in making certain decisions in TOAs. Next slide, please. So the minimum allowable density framework, just sort of a name that we refer to restriction on zoning authority in transit-oriented areas, such that a local government may not reject a rezoning application. So this is based on a decision about zoning, based on the density or height exceeding what is currently allowed if what is proposed is less than or equal to the prescribed minimum allowable density or height established in the regulations, and any exemptions do not apply. And the regulations use two metrics to determine the minimum allowable density and height. So density as set out as floor area ratio, or FSR, and building height measured in stories. The regulations establish minimum levels of density that municipalities must allow for, and it varies in proximity to different types of transit stations. And so I have more information on that in the following slides. So next slide, please. So for the this should actually be passenger rail type transit stations. So in the case of passenger rail SkyTrain transit-oriented area, the designation distance, as I mentioned earlier, is 800 meters crow flies measured from the station coordinate. And there are three land tiers within that 800 meter radius. The first at 0 to 200 meters, the second at 2 to 400 meters, and the third at 4 to 800 meters. And they each have their own independent density and height metrics associated with them. And page 30, specifically page 30 of the policy manual, is a good reference for all of this information about the various densities and heights and various tiers associated with the stations. So the next type of station is a bus exchange and West Coast Express type. In that case, the designation distance is 400 meters crow fly measured from the station coordinate. In this case, it's a bit complex to put on one slide. Again, so page 30 of the policy manual is a really good place to reference for this. But this is just sort of a summary of how the density and the height vary depending on the distance from the station coordinate and the municipality that the station is located in. Next slide, please. So this sort of provides an example of how the minimum density and height framework are intended to function. In this case, this illustrates a SkyTrain type right in tier 1, so adjacent to the station and out to 200 meters. So the metrics established in the regulation are 5.0 FAR and 20 stories in height. So at the bottom of this chart on the lower right, developers can submit rezoning applications that may exceed the maximum permitted density and building height that's established in the zoning bylaw, the current zoning. So there we see current zoning is at the bottom. In most cases, the provincial minimum density framework will set a density and height that's above what's currently permitted in the zoning bylaw. So this is what we're showing here as something called the provincial density and provincial height envelope. So that's the sort of middle section there. And I should point out that the legislation doesn't limit what's happening in this envelope, so the density to a particular type of use. So it just says must not prohibit or restrict the density or height set out in the regulation. So as an example, a proposal or request could be for 4.0 FAR residential uses and 1.0 FAR for commercial use, for a total of 5.0 FAR. And then finally, at the top would be up to local government discretion. So if a proposal is above either of these values, so 5.1 FAR or 22 stories, that portion is remains in the discretion of the local government. Next slide, please. So going back to our example from earlier, so this is showing a couple of things. So the green and pink circles indicating the 200 and 400 meter designation distance for the tier 1 and tier 2 land area, and then the outer perimeter being the tier 3 land area. And there are rules in the regulation about assigning the if a land parcel of land is bisected by the outer boundary, then it's considered within the transit-oriented area. And if it's bisected by any of so the green or pink, so if there's a question as to which density tier it lies in, because it's bisected by that distance, it lies with the higher density tier. So a bit about zoning in general, rezoning processes in TOAs. We anticipate that because of the complexity and scale of transit-oriented development projects that will be expected in transit-oriented areas, rezonings will still be the norm in transit-oriented areas. So there's no requirement as part of Bill 47 to go about proactively zoning to permit the minimum allowable densities outright. And I should point out that it doesn't, the minimum allowable density is a restriction on zoning authority. It doesn't change other aspects of the rezoning process itself. So those might be submission requirements, how staff report, make recommendations to council, the procedures like bylaw introduction and readings, and authorities that are also within the zoning envelope for in terms of local government authority. So rental tenure zoning continues to be in place, establishing engineering conditions and that type of thing. Those continue to apply. Not all parcels of land that fall within a TOA are subject to minimum allowable density. The intent is that the minimum allowable density framework applies to parcels in which the current zoning permits residential land use. So when the example of a parcel where, for example, it might be commercial, some sort of commercial zone where residential is not permitted, the minimum allowable density does not apply on those particular parcels of land. There are two exemption cases to that. The first is on lands that are zoned to permit an industrial use, or land zoned to permit an agricultural use. That's the second exemption case, where a residential use is secondary or ancillary to the primary use of industrial or agricultural. The reason is that we're aware of broader strategic concerns about, for example, the availability and constraints on availability of industrial land, particularly in the Lower Mainland. And the intention is to ensure that local governments continue to have full discretion over changes in use within transit-oriented areas. Go back one just for a sec. And other requirements, however, if a parcel is exempted, other requirements continue to apply. So for example, the no parking minimums for residential off-street parking and the requirements to consider the policy manual, those still apply. Okay, next slide. Development applications are still subject to other applicable policies and processes associated with development review. So those include development permit area guidelines, heritage protections and policies, and other provincial and federal statutes. So examples that we've included here are RAPPER and airport zoning. Next slide, please. So the next thing that happens in TOAs is that local governments cannot use their authority to regulate parking, the provision of parking spaces, to require the provision of off-street spaces that are related to residential uses within transit-oriented areas. The intention is that developers would decide on the appropriate number of parking spaces based on conditions and market demand, and to encourage the reduction in development costs. And as I noted earlier, though, the key point is that local governments are required to realign their parking regulation bylaws with this legislative requirement by June 30th, 2024. Next slide. However, there are exemptions to this. So local governments may continue to regulate the provision of accessible parking spaces, as well as loading spaces for all land uses in TOA. So that continues. To require parking spaces for other non-residential land uses. So likely will be high occurrences of mixed uses as generally encouraged near transit. So for commercial uses, local government bylaws can continue to require parking space provision. And I should note that the legislation provides the authority for the province to require off-street parking provision spaces. By regulation, that authority has not been used at that point, but it was included in the legislation as to allow for potential course-correcting measures in the future. So a bit about the provincial policy manual for transit-oriented areas. In broad terms, the policy manual is intended to support local governments with implementing the legislative requirements. That's its main purpose. And the legislation requires local governments to consider the manual when making the following decisions. So it's when designating transit-oriented areas by bylaw, when developing or amending an official community plan for land in a TOA, for developing and amending a zoning bylaw for land in a TOA, and developing and adopting parking regulation bylaw. And just to, I think I mentioned this earlier, but the statute refers to this document as a provincial policy guideline. Next slide, please. So the manual is separated into two parts. The first sort of goes in the same discussion as this webinar. It provides a detailed overview of the legislative and regulatory changes related to Bill 47 and transit-oriented areas, and then provides guidance on implementing the legislation and regulations. It also includes the descriptions for how local government should designate TOAs by bylaw. So next, a few considerations for local governments as they work to implement the legislative requirements. So about a slide about other tools in securing benefits. So local governments will still be able to apply other existing legislated tools in transit-oriented areas. So an example of that is continuing to use, if desired, rental tenure zoning in transit-oriented areas. The legislation allows local governments to establish base and conditional densities for the purpose of density bonusing. So density bonus authorities, those can continue to be used, but at this time, the density in relation to density bonus, use of density bonusing, the base density is expected to be the minimum allowable as established by the regulations. And some municipalities have flagged this as a concern for them, and we are aware of that, and we appreciate the information and feedback that's been provided from local staff and from elected officials. So we hear you, and we are looking into the matter. And I think moving forward, we do need to achieve a balance with other authorities, such as the use of potential use of amenity cost charges. Also, the province is currently exploring policy options and additional tools, including the potential use of a potential implementation of inclusionary zoning authority. So we hope to have more information on that soon. Next slide, please. So we also know that there's lots of development activity in areas near transit. So it's likely that there will be in-stream applications that are in progress at the time the legislation came into effect. Due to this, the legislation provides that any official community plan or zoning bylaw that's received first reading at the time the legislation came into force, so that's December 7th, is not required to meet the new legislative requirements. An in-stream application would not, there's no requirement to amend it to allow for the minimum density set out in the regulation. It's sort of under the rules prior to the implementation or enactment of Bill 47. Next slide. So the Bill 47 or transit legislation intersects with other recent legislative changes to land use planning framework, including Bill 44, which has sort of two pieces that I'm going to be speaking about here, and that's the small scale multi-unit housing requirements. And you probably already know this, but Bill 44 requires all local governments to allow secondary suites or ADUs in single family zones by June 30th, 2024, and requirements as well to allow for 3, 4, 6 units on lot zone for single family duplex units, depending on the lot size and proximity to frequent transit service, subject to exemptions by June 30th. So it's important to note that parcels that fall within a designated transit-oriented area are exempted from the requirement to zone for the 3, 4, or 6 unit under the SMU small-scale multi-unit legislation. The second piece of Bill 44 here is the longer-term proactive zoning components. So specifically, Bill 44 requires all local governments to update their housing needs reports on a regular basis using a standard method and a 20-year outlook. Requires that an interim H&R be completed by January 1st, 2025. And then a follow-on to that is an update to OCPs and zoning bylaws based on the interim H&R by December 31st, 2025. And as I spoke about earlier in the presentation, there's no requirement on the part of Bill 47 to proactively zone in TOAs to the minimum allowable density set out in the regulations. However, it's highly likely that some local governments would be interested in or may choose to update their OCP designations and zoning in transit-oriented areas to meet the 20-year housing need in the longer term. Finally, just want to speak about a requirement that any bylaw enacted by a local government must be consistent with OCP. So Section 478 of the LGA sets out this requirement of sort of consistency with official community plans. As part of Bill 47, there was a transitional provision that exempts local governments from this requirement in circumstances where, in complying with the minimum allowable density, and they're making a zoning decision in a TOA that may be out of sync with the OCP. So that provision is in effect until December 31st, 2025. So that's that same timeline that I covered in the previous slide to amend OCPs based on housing needs reports, based on the interim housing needs report. So that's about it for the presentation related to Bill 47. There are upcoming webinars that will undoubtedly be of interest to most of you if you're not already registered. So January 22nd, 23rd, presentations on small scale multi-unit, and then on the 25th, we will do another version of this webinar, the same webinar again, with the intent that's for municipalities outside of Metro Vancouver. And again, this is the link, I think it's in the chat box as well, to the local government housing initiatives website. So if you haven't viewed that website, I encourage you to do so. We will be placing all updates and materials on that particular website.
All right, Mark, over to me.
Yes, please. Thank you, Rebecca.
Thank you, Mark. Really appreciate you going through that technical detail. So we have about an hour left today, so we're going to work through your questions, focusing on those with the most upvotes. We will skip any questions that have already been answered. And we may need to follow up on some questions. And if we do, we'll ask you to reach out to us using the plum@gov.bc.ca email that I know many of you are becoming familiar with. I'm also going to ask our host to repost the resources in the chat for those of you who may have joined late, because I understand you can't see chat items that came up earlier. So if we could just get those posted back up. If we see sort of housekeeping questions come up, we're just going to type answers to that, and you should be able to see those. All right, so the first question for Modi, which is, how do future consolidations affect the designation of lands within a TOA? For example, if a developer consolidates 9 lots that are not in a TOA with a 10th lot that is within a TOA, does the TOA density heights now apply to the entire consolidation, or do TOA densities only apply to parcels within a TOA at the time of adoption of the TOA bylaw? So looking to Clarence, do you want to dive in on that first question?
You, Clarence.
All right, Clarence, you may need to sort out your mute button there. So Teresa, are you able to dive in on that one?
Yeah, let me take a run at it while Clarence is figuring out his technology here. The designation only applies to parcels in the configuration at the time of designation, right? So you might want to consult with your legal staff with the city, and it may be that as you're doing your TOD planning and your rezoning, you want to expand and change those boundaries that make a little more sense. But the designation only applies to those parcels that are touched. Now, if the parcel is bisected, and you'll see in the manual, it says if it's partially within, it's considered wholly within. So when Mark was showing those maps with green and pink and blue, that's what that was representing. But the designation only applies to the parcels in their configuration at time of designation. Clarence, is that good?
That is correct. Can you hear me now, Rebecca?
Yes, perfect. Back on track. Okay, great. Thank you for that, Teresa. So next question is around potential geographic barriers and the opportunity for local governments to work with the province around the designation of those parcels when there are those potential geographic considerations. Sorry, my thing just popped down, but the barriers that make them not accessible. Clarence, is that something you can speak to?
Yeah, just to clarify, is that looking like steep slopes or rivers that cut across? Is that the geographic piece that is referring to?
Well, they're not able to respond, so let's assume that that's what the question is about.
Yeah. So that's no different from other current developments. If there are like topography or geography challenges like that, those are things that are considered. So that's part of the policy that local government, when they do work with the development applicants, is to work through.
However, the designation does require you.
Exactly.
The regulations right now do require local governments to designate that entire area.
Correct.
Great. Okay, so next question. What density should municipalities anticipate for future bus rapid transit stations? Similar level to SkyTrain station or bus exchange? Clarence?
Yeah, so for future projects here, so those are longer term. So there will be more discussions between the local government, the province, and the transit agency. So those are kind of future projects that are not within the current scope within the regulations.
Great. All right. Regarding rezoning bylaws that are consistent with TOA regulations, but not consistent with existing OCPs, because OCP update has not yet taken place, do these bylaws require public hearings? So I don't know, Clarence, are you able to take a run at that one?
Could I defer to Teresa and Mark on this one?
I would say yes. Yes, yeah, unless Mark wants to correct me on that. I would say absolutely. And there is a grace period in approving zoning bylaws that aren't consistent with the OCP until local governments have a chance to get that first cycle up to speed, which is, I think, December 2025.
Great. Okay. And can you clarify if a single parcel in a land assembly touching the transit-oriented area would subject the entire assembly to the designation? Clarence?
This is similar to the question that we had previously. The legislation and the regulations speak to parcels, not land assembly. It'll be up to the local governments to make that interpretation. Some local governments may want to have a strict interpretation. Some may want to provide more flexibility, but that would be up to the local governments.
Great. All right, so can municipalities mandate the provision of transit passes or car share benefits for new developments, including those in TOAs, such as on page 45 in the SMA policy manual? So moreover, are municipalities allowed to create bylaws to enforce on-site transportation demand management measures for both SMA and TOA related developments? I'm just going to loop back on that one because there was a lot in there. Can municipalities mandate the provision of transit passes or car share benefits for new developments? And are municipalities allowed to create bylaws to enforce on-site transportation demand measurement measures for both SMA and TOA related developments? Teresa?
Yeah, this speaks to your authority to impose TDM measures, which are always good. They achieve a lot of MODI and other provincial ministries' goals in terms of transit use and climate change and clean air, and all of those local authorities are still in the force. So yes.
Rebecca, I just can mention as well that, and I spoke a bit about this during the presentation, that We know that there's a lot of interest in this area on the part of many municipalities, and we're definitely aware of that and exploring potential options in terms of moving forward here. So just aware of the interest in TDM measures. Let's just say that. So thanks for the flag and the question, though.
Great. Thanks, Mark. Okay, so at a previous meeting, there was indication that you may be open to allowing TOA boundaries to be moved, shifted, not shrunk, to allow municipalities to better account for local conditions. If municipalities can achieve the same or better housing outcomes by adjusting the TOA boundaries, could this be proposed? The goal would be the same overall meters squared of upzoned land, the same height and density provisions, and also ensuring change takes place within walkable proximity to transit.
I'll take
Teresa?
it. Sure, I'll take it. This is similar to what we've been talking about. And I hear, we hear, I hear, that there's a lot of interest in that. Right now, there's not a provision to amend these boundaries in the regulations or in the legislation. But this is one of a number of things that we're thinking about here. This is a really thoughtful way to put this question. And we are looking at those constraints, but we don't have any additional guidance for you at this time.
Great. Okay, thanks for that, Teresa. Next question. Would land zoned for park be exempt from TOA? And the park zones which permit accessory residential use, so such as a caretaker unit. I think I'll leave the question at that. I think it's clear enough from that without getting into the detail. Can somebody, Teresa, do you want to take that one on, or Mark?
If your underlying base zoning allows residential uses, then it's subject to it. If it's just ancillary uses like a caretaker quarters or something like that in an industrial zone, it would not be. But if your parks are designated as single family, and sometimes they are, it would be within, it would be subject to the new regulations.
Great. Okay, this next question is along the lines of questions we've already answered, but I think it's worth just being explicit. The presence of slope, riparian, flood, or other environmental hazard areas affects buildable lot area. Should TOA density be considered based on net or gross lot area?
We don't have any advice for you on gross versus net. I think that's something that's clearly within the purview of local governments to make decisions on, and you probably need to talk to your legal counsel about that.
Great. Teresa, this looks like another one for you. What does this bylaw, if it's not a zoning bylaw or an OCP bylaw, look like? Is it just the municipality adopting, acknowledging the TOA areas identified in the legislation? Does it identify, designate the parcels of land that are subject to the rules of the TOA legislation?
And maybe Mark can help me on this one, but it does all those things, right? We'll need you to pass a bylaw and include a map. And the bylaw would specify the specifications. I know I've read another question a little further down about whether or not cities or municipalities can include their exemptions in the bylaw. And so maybe we could cover both those off at one time. Mark, is that all the bylaw needs to do?
The bylaw needs to designate the transit-oriented area with respect to the legislative requirement. The legislation says may include a map or other graphic material. Probably be a better way to do that than meters and bounds. But yeah, I mean, it is for the purpose of designating the geographic area, the transit-oriented area or areas It doesn't necessarily have to get into exemptions. The requirement is to designate the area.
The next question follows along the same lines around whether it needs to identify the relevant radii and identify specific lots. Or identify specific lots and their associated heights and densities. Mark, are you able to clarify?
Yeah, the legislation, the definition in the legislation is the purpose of the bylaw. So bylaw is to designate the transit-oriented area. There's no requirement to indicate the tiers. It's the in or out question, and showing the coverage of that circular crow flies distance.
Great, thank you. Okay, the next question is around inclusionary zoning. There has been some allusions made to inclusionary zoning legislation. We know there's a high level of interest in inclusionary zoning, and we hope to be able to share more information about this. We're exploring some options, and we hope to be able to share some information in the near future. And then next question. In addition to industrial and agricultural uses, there are other uses where transit-oriented development is not appropriate, but where a zoning bylaw allows an ancillary residential use, such as land for institutional or recreational uses. What will be the process for expanding the list of exempted uses? Clarence, is this something you want to take a run at?
No, I'll pass it over to my colleagues.
I think we don't have a process for expanding that list. We do anticipate there'll be future updates to the manual. We want to be responsive to the feedback that we're getting from cities. That's not something that we currently have on our list to look at right now, however. For institutional and recreational uses, I assume you're talking about schools and parks, which probably aren't going to be developed anyway. But we can put that on our list of things to think about if you'd like.
Great, thanks. All right, so the next question is about the TOA designation bylaw and how it relates to or interacts with the OCP, i.e. what does it actually do other than mirror the maps that have already been provided? And I'm thinking, Teresa or Mark, this would probably come to one of you.
Yeah, I'll give it a shot. But this is an acknowledgement that the cities understand that area. There's no requirement for pre-zoning. There's no requirement to go in and do a small area plan around these transit areas. However, it'd be good land use planning practices, and I'm sure most local governments will want to do that. But it's just an acknowledgement that that is the designation, and that's the provincial expectation. So when you're considering rezoning applications, those within that designated area, those are the minimum allowable densities. Hope that helps.
Great. All right. Is there a minimum portion of residential required in order to fit within the TOA framework? For example, what if a proposal is 4.5 FSR office and 0.5 FSR residential? Teresa?
Sure, yeah, the expectation, of course, is to increase housing supply. Having said that, there's not been any kind of restriction on local government's authority to designate tenure or uses. There may be areas of your municipality that are kind of a core office. That's understandable. There could be areas of your city that you want to have a good mix of uses, and there could be areas where you want primarily residential. But at this point, there's no restriction on use or tenure. It's up to the local governments to make that decision.
Right. All right, the next question is about design guidelines. Does the municipality retain the ability to identify and require adherence to design guidelines if those guidelines allow development to the maximum height, but where those regulations potentially limit maximum FAR, i.e. tower and building separation, building length, or floor plate size requirements, street wall provisions? Will those need to be located in zoning or OCP to effectively respond to legislation?
So yes, local government retains all their authority. And what this legislation does is say that local governments cannot deny an application solely based on height or FSR, right? And we put in minimum minimum height and minimum FSR. Having said that, you have your full suite of zoning powers to regulate block length and tower separations and upper story setbacks and all of those types of things to shape, you know, the development that you want and get the kind of uses that you want. So yes, I believe both of those are appropriate to go in your small area plans and absolutely in your zoning bylaw. And Mark, you want to correct me on anything there?
No, that's great. Thanks, Teresa.
Great. All right. So the next question, and sorry, my questions just jumped to the bottom, but the next question relates to what happens if a muni, so this is something to do with employment or rental housing objectives. So what happens if a muni prescribes rental as part of the minimum allowable densities, but a developer chooses not to pursue that route? In this case, can the muni assign a trade-off cost, such as the CAC or ACC? If not, how does the province expect the munis to achieve employment or rental housing objectives?
That is a great question. So if you, the local authority can set tenure. So if you're requiring rental and a developer doesn't want to provide rental, check with your lawyers. Right? You can deny that permit. Right? You can deny that zoning application. If you're looking for a choice, like you can do so much strata with this or so much rental with this, again, you can provide those options. And ACCs are absolutely a tool. And I believe CAC, there's no restriction on either of those at this point. ACCs have been expanded with the new legislation. So I think you're good to go on that one.
Great. Thanks, Teresa. Okay, next question. How will BIRT corridor stations that use rapid bus be designated?
I don't, Clarence, you're going to have to answer that one. I do not know about that.
So again, just going back to the current regulations, bus rapid BRTs, they do not currently exist in BC, so that's part of the future planning on it. So that currently right now, there's no requirement to look into that. So that's something that we're also working with the transit agencies on.
Great, thank you. All right, Bill 44. So that's the proactive zoning and small scale multi-unit housing discusses how local governments can still zone for tenure, rental tenure zoning. But the Bill 47 policy guide does not address this. Can you confirm local governments can still zone for tenure in TOD areas? Could we set lower heights density for strata types and meet the Bill 47 height densities for RTZ only?
You can zone for rental tenure. Yes. I don't know about the second part of that question, Mark. As long as the developer has an option to get to the maximum, is that?
Yeah, but it might be. It is good. It's a very good question. That it might be a bit of a takeaway one.
That might stop us.
To like we're limited in what we can do in terms of interpreting and providing advice. We can kind of point to information and that type of thing, but the restriction on zoning authority in TOAs states that local governments cannot prohibit or restrict the density set on the regulations, given if the exemptions don't apply. So it would point to not being able to kind of outline, you know, if this then that conditions in relation to tenure and other factors, and being able to prohibit or restrict that density. But I think it's a bit of a takeaway for us that one.
And so I'll ask the person who asked the question to follow up with us at plum@gov.bc.ca.
That'd be great.
Great. Okay, next question. So can you explain why you are including building height minimums when building height is not linked to density? Will this not encourage towers and lot consolidation to the detriment of more fine-grained, vibrant, smaller scale developments? Teresa.
Necessarily think that's true. We wanted to provide flexibility, right? So that local governments can have their own character form of development. It may be that, you know, you have a wide podium and a more slender tower. You could have tower separations. We wanted to provide some flexibility there because all your other zoning authorities are in place. Like I said, block faces, separation, podium heights, all of those things, so that you can achieve a form of development that's characteristic of your city and of the particular neighborhood that you're in.
Right. All right. Another question about tenure. And how can different tenures be secured, e.g. below market rental, and condo? Teresa, do you want to speak to that, or Mark?
Mark has touched on this a couple of times. I know a lot of cities, some represented here today. I have a lot of success with density bonusing and other tools, and the suite of tools that are still available to you.
Great, thank you. Mark, did you want to add anything to that?
Existing processes, it does not address tenure, and it doesn't prevent use of rental tenure zoning.
Great. Okay, so for landowners that have large master plan parcels, can there be a variation in building heights below and above the minimum, so long as it is within the allowable FAR and supported by the municipality?
So this is a really good question, right? So as I'm reading it, what the question is let's say the allowable height is 12 stories, you're in the 12-story range, but because of assembly issues or just the developer and financing issues, the zoning application is only for 10. Can you accept 10? Yes, you can accept 10, right? And you can approve 10. However, we set that minimum knowing that not all developments will propose the maximum, or will be, you may not be able to achieve that maximum height on every single parcel for a variety of reasons. So if you get an application submitted that's under the allowable, yes, you can accept it, and yes, you can approve it.
Great. Okay, there's a follow-up question on the desire for flexibility for the boundaries of TOAs to address local context. I mean, I think this has been asked and answered, but does anyone want to add anything at this point to the rationale for this? No. Okay. Teresa, were you going to say something? You went off.
Well, I was going to say the ministry had quite a bit of modeling done, right? And the ministry also looked at, did a survey of all the local governments who already have TOA policies, who already have TOD plans, and there's some great work out there. And this was, the way these were set were based on some subject matter experts that we consulted with. And after we took a look at, did an analysis of kind of what's best practices out, particularly in the Lower Mainland today. That's how they were drugged in.
Yeah, thanks for that. Very helpful. Okay, so why were the density thresholds set at arbitrary density and height levels? How did the base densities and heights get set? Who informed the process, and why were they set at those specific densities and heights? So,
yeah, we just talked about that.
Yeah, exactly. Okay. As municipal planners with the appropriate local knowledge of our communities, okay, there's another question here about the TOA boundaries, so I'm just going to move on from that. And I can see some of the ones that we've already answered are still in the list, so maybe I could have a few people go through and tidy up these questions here. What type of density is within the minimum FAR? Is it only residential? If so, is it market, rental, non-market? What about commercial? So this kind of goes back to the 10-year question to a degree, but with the addition of commercial in here. Do you want to add anything to that?
No, that's mix of uses, tenure, affordability, all within the local government's purview to set those requirements.
Okay, great. In creating the TOA, may local governments use some discretion that still meet the intent of the legislation, i.e. using a road as a TOA boundary rather than including a few random properties that are just within 800-meter concentric boundary. Many of the boundaries cut through the neighborhoods in an arbitrary way.
So this is the question that we keep answering, right? You have to designate that distance, that minimum distance. You have to designate that. Now, if you want to, because it's going to make sense when you do your local planning and your local area plans and your zoning, you're not going to want a circle, right? You're going to want to go to the next road or the creek or that type of, or, you know, go around the back of the lots. You're going to use good land use planning principles to make those decisions. And that's within your purview, but on your designation, you must designate that minimum circle.
Great. Okay, so in Tier 1, where a developer seeks 5.0 FAR on a given lot, but that would result in a building 30 stories in height, does the municipality have the authority to not approve the application as it exceeds the mandated 20-story height if the municipality itself has not permitted a taller height?
I would consult with your attorneys about that. That is the minimum allowable. You don't have to, but you should, so that you're not looking at it's not arbitrary, right? And it could be 30, reaching 30 stories because they haven't consolidated a large enough parcel, right? So look to those other good land use planning principles to base your analysis and your evaluation of that case.
Great. All right. Not all municipalities pre-zone land, some designate. Can we exempt industrial designated land from TOA's minimum allowable densities to protect them if they are already zoned residential? If not, how can munis protect employment designated but not employment zoned lands appropriately?
So remember this legislation and the regulations apply to lands that are allowing residential as a primary use, right? So if your industrial lands, oh, I see, because your zoning hasn't caught up with your OCP. If your industrial lands are still zoned for residential, that's a good question. We should take that one away and think about that, because you're behind. You're behind in designating your industrial and employment lands, I see. If you would email the Plum email on this one and let us take this one away, because you do have a basis in your OCP. Let us take a look at this one. Thanks for that. It's a good question.
Yeah, thanks, Teresa. Could you elaborate why some transit exchanges, such as Carvault and Langley, are excluded from the TOAs?
Yep. If they, according to the in the TOA manual, especially for bus exchanges, there is the criteria on how the current infrastructure of bus exchange was selected. So if it didn't meet as one of the criteria 15 minutes, that specific bus exchange or that transit exchange would not be included in the current set of regulations.
Great. And was there considerations to allow minimum visitor parking spaces?
I don't know, but you can still, if you're in a mixed use, right? If it's a mixed use, hopefully you'll get a lot of mixed use and close to transit. You can still require parking for commercial, non-residential uses. You can still require loading and unloading and have handicap accessible spaces. And developers can, if they choose to include parking in their development, they can. The cities just can't require it for the residential portion of the building.
Great, thanks for that. All right, am I understanding that it's not a guarantee that developers will be able to achieve the minimum height and density? They would still be subject to FOD review, including view cones, shadowing impacts, tower separation, lot unit depths, etc.
Yes.
All right, and can the province clarify why the TOA designation bylaw may not consider geographic barriers? I think we've already covered this one off several times, so we'll maybe move on from that. Do TOA designations affect RGS Metro 2050 employment lands designations where accessory residential uses within 200 meters may be permitted?
So the legislation speaks to properties that are currently zoned for residential uses. So you'd have to go look at your metro designation, check your own OCP, check your own zoning designation. And if zoning is permitted as a primary use, if residential is permitted as a primary use and not just an accessory use, then the regulations do apply.
Right. how do the prescribed heights relate to federal airport zoning regulations?
That's a great question. And the manual does have some, how this legislation relates to some other provincial legislation. And of course, provincial rules are going to preempt any kind of federal regulations are going to preempt any provincial requirements.
Okay. The next question is around infrastructure and amenities. So for large lots, does the density and height provisions, i.e. 5.0 FAR 20 stories on a site that would need new road and open space dedications, park, schools, environmental protections, will the city be required to accept a proposal that does not include these public needs?
No, you still have all of those authorities. If you're getting all of those SRW dedications, parks, all of that through your zoning authority now, you can continue to do that. Absolutely. Upgrading your water lines and sewer lines, all of those engineering requirements still intact.
All right. And can cities require, oh, sorry, mine just jumped around. I'm just going to carry on where I was though. Can cities require cash in lieu for parking excess? For example, developers would pay if they exceed a parking maximum.
You can't set a parking requirement for residential, even if it's a parking maximum, right? So you can't take a cash in lieu for something that you can't require. That's my reading of it. Mark, do I have that right? Did I screw that up?
Yeah, so no, the current authorities prior to Bill 47 are that because local governments can establish parking regulations to require parking minimums, they can also establish payment in lieu regimes regarding taking payments in exchange for some of the spaces. Because there's a prohibition on requiring spaces for residential uses, there will be limitation on the ability to use the payment in lieu. It still can be used for other land uses in TOAs, but just not for residential purposes.
Great. So the next question is, if a TOA has already been identified, such as the Cambie Corridor Station, when can we reasonably expect city staff to accept new applications based on the provincial height and FSR? And maybe whoever answers this could also, just for the benefit of everybody on the call, clarify if we're speaking to those that are already designated or those that need to be if this is one that needs to be designated by June 30th.
Well, the Cambie Corridor has a lot of stops on it, the Canada line. And it could be, so yeah, so Cambie's probably already designated, right? It was probably one of the ones that was effective December 7th. And as for when the city staff will accept new applications, Modi does not have a role there. You'll need to contact the planning department at City of Vancouver.
Great. Can a local government require bicycle parking for residential uses?
That might be part of your TDM measures. Mark, what are your thoughts about that?
Well, it would depend on a comparison before and after would depend on how you secure bicycle parking today or prior to the Bill 47. This might have to look into this in more detail, but it could arguably be a provision of TDM measure. Yeah, I'd have to look into the legislation in more detail.
Okay, great. Thanks, Mark. And you're welcome to follow up with us at plum@gov.bc.ca. So the next question is around process to exempt TOAs, for example, for hazard lands. I think we've touched on this a little bit, but does somebody want to jump in here?
There's some guidance in the manual on this, if you want to check that. Yeah.
Great. Has the province conducted any parking analysis studies for TODs within the density ranges proposed?
I think staff here have looked at the broader metro studies in terms of informing our decisions on parking. Yeah.
Great. And is there consideration for exemptions in job space and/or entertainment districts where municipalities are actively leading planning processes to limit existing housing uses in order to support essential economic and cultural objectives?
Well, there's not an exemption for the job space, but you can set different types of uses. You know, you can't, the 5 FSR doesn't have to be all residential. You can include 3 a bottom story of retail, a couple of stories of office. You absolutely have that within your authority to do that. So it wouldn't exempt it, but it does allow for the city to set the types of uses and the tenure.
Great. And could a municipality reject a rezoning application on the basis that it would result in the demolition of one or more significant existing rental buildings that are providing affordable market housing?
You please check with your legal counsel.
Yeah, this.
I don't want to wade into that. You need to check with your attorney's office about that.
Okay, so next question. Does Order 678 replace Order 677? The list of stations is different and effective days are different.
Order 678 amends the list of stations in 677, effective June 30th. So that's why the dates are different. The list in the regulation that's effective now, or was effective December 7th, is the 52 interim stations. That's what's there today. And OIC 678 amends that list and expands it effective June 30th. It's this the way that the legislation and the regulations work in order to give effect to that.
Thanks, Mark. We have a couple questions now that are similar. So the questions are around whether it's density or height or density and height. Are both criteria applicable or only one?
Thanks, Rebecca. Yeah, this is the question we've talked about a lot, and the way the second question poses it, I think is really good. It's what we were looking at in terms of flexibility. It says, is it both 5 FSR and 20 stories height, or is it an or situation? It's and. Then the writer goes on to say, thinking a 12-story building can hit 5, and many 20-story forms would exceed 5. Perhaps this is where the municipal authority over form development comes into play. Yes, absolutely right. That's exactly what we were thinking, that we wanted to provide some flexibility.
Great. And this isn't quite a question, but I'll see where it lands. Stations listed in 677 are not yet constructed in Surrey, but the effective date is December 7th, 2023. So no question in here. Does anybody wish to comment on or explain that?
Yeah, I can take that one, Mark, and maybe you can add it. So you're right. Those were probably the Surrey Langley SkyTrain stations. But again, as part of the policy work was done, if there is reference to anything that's transit-oriented related within their OCP, which that specific location is identified, that would be identified as an effective date, similar to all the other first 52 that Mark highlighted. And Mark, is there anything you want to add about that in how it's laid out in the legislation or anything?
It's not set on the I mean, it's in the regulations. They're under construction. That's as I understand, that's the reason why it's there.
Right.
Or planned and funded for construction. They're not under construction yet, but they will be. Yeah.
Yeah.
Great. Thanks. Bill 44 prohibits the holding of a public hearing for the purpose of implementing SMA requirements into the zoning bylaw. Is a public hearing required for the implementation? I presume that means designation of a TOA, whether in its own bylaw or in a zoning bylaw.
Yes, you'll want to hold a public hearing when your council is presented with the zoning bylaw to establish the new zoning, if you're going to pre-zone, right? Or your OCP.
Do we want to provide a little bit more nuance on that? Because I think it was unclear from the question whether they meant designation of a TOA versus zoning bylaw update. They asked a couple, sort of. Teresa?
There are public hearing requirements. I was formerly in Vancouver, so I'm going to take a stab. Mark, tell me if I'm wrong. I imagine there are public hearing requirements for updating your OCP, right? And so those would still be a requirement. Your zoning bylaws, adopting a new zoning bylaws, whether you're looking at new pre-zoning in this area or single site rezoning applications, those will require public hearing also.
Mark, did you want to add to that?
So I just add that basically the way I think about it is the Bill 44 made amendments to the public hearing requirements that public hearing must not be held if proposed zoning bylaw, and there's nuance to it with regard to the proportion of the proposal that is residential use in terms of GFA and the proportion of as a proportion of the total being proposed. But if the zoning bylaw being proposed is consistent with the OCP bylaw that's currently in force, then it would be no public hearing. But if there's an inconsistency, then it would be an option, or the public hearing would be held, I guess.
Great, thank you for that. I'll just note we have just a little over 10 minutes left, so we're going to do our best to get through your questions. So the next question is about heritage protections. You note in the slides that heritage protections remain, but there is no exemption in the legislation or regs for protected heritage properties and TOAs. Mark, can you speak to this?
So where there's provincial legislation that takes effect, it generally, in terms of legal effect, it would supersede local bylaws. And that is the intention behind. So behind developing or configuring the legislation the way that it was configured. So it wasn't really necessary to do so. If a heritage property is protected by bylaw, the heritage provisions, the Heritage Conservation Act applies in those cases.
Thanks, Mark. And I believe there's more detail on page 15 of the manual. All right, if designating a TOA within an OCP bylaw, sorry, we just jumped around again. Will the ministry consider the TOA to be designated by June 30th if the bylaw is sitting at third reading? Just thinking about referral requirements, such as new regional context statement, which would be approved between third reading and adoption of the municipal OCP bylaw and have a timeline associated with it.
I think that would be okay. Mark, is that okay? I think that'd be okay, as long as it's passed at least first reading, right?
In terms of designation bylaw sitting at third reading, the intent was that the municipal level, the bylaws are adopted. There's no requirement in the legislation to immediately start thinking about context statements and RGS and that type of thing. So the intent is adoption by June 30th.
Right. Thanks, Mark.
Great. Okay, so municipalities do not need to provide any reasons for rejecting applications. In such a case, how will it be determined if the rejection was valid?
I think that's probably something that you need to discuss with your attorney's office.
Yeah, thank you. All right. There is a question here about the application of density and heights to schools and parks, and I think, Teresa, you've already covered that one off. So next question, using tier 1 as an example, 5 FAR can be achieved with a building lower than 20 stories. Do municipalities have discretion to do this?
We've talked about this a lot, right?
Mm-hmm.
Mm-hmm.
Okay. Can cities change existing residential areas to commercial, industrial, institutional, or park, in which case would residential FAR minimum still apply? I think we've touched on the second half of that question, but is there something in here around changing existing uses that we need to address?
The intention is that local governments retain full discretion over changes in use. Right. So as changes in use occur over time, that's part of the kind of universe of discretion and decision making on part of councils that are advised by staff.
Great. What if a property owner is unable to achieve the minimum allowable density without exceeding the minimum allowable height, for example, on a large site?
So those are questions of lot size, minimum lot frontages that the local governments will need to discuss with the property owners.
Okay. So today's presentation noted that local governments can't refuse rezonings on the basis of height and density consistent with the OCP. Parking restrictions were worded differently. Does this mean a local government could still refuse a rezoning on the basis of parking, even in the absence of an applicable bylaw?
So if the question is, it's an application for 5 FSR and 20 stories, and they haven't provided any parking, can you deny it based on the not having parking? I would please check with your attorneys about that.
Thanks. If land is designated in OCP for mixed use, residential, commercial, but zoned industrial, does the exemption still apply?
The exemption applies to the zoning, right? So it's how the land is zoned.
Right. And So just to be clear, on the flexibility of height density, if a developer proposes, I think that's meant to say 5 FSR and 20 stories, is it correct to say that the local government would say yes to the FSR, but no to the height on the basis of urban design considerations, and instead require the developer to come back with a 12-story form that achieves 5 FSR?
Should check with your legal counsel about that. Right?
Can the TOA bylaw be included as part of a zoning bylaw?
That would be at the discretion of the local government.
Where a dedication is needed for road or environmental purposes, does the TOA density requirement apply based on the original lot area or the net residual area?
So we don't provide any guidance on whether it will be net or gross. You probably already have zoning policy guidance on that in your current zoning bylaws, and all that guidance would still apply.
Right. And looking to future TOAs, how should a muni accommodate future TOAs, e.g. BIRT terminus at Park Royal?
Clarence, you got that one?
Yeah, I'm just looking at how should municipality future TOEs like the BERT terminal at Park Royal. Teresa, maybe I think that's just part of the planning process as they develop the area plans. I think that's the sole authority of how the municipality would like to develop that area. But for future, again, going back, again, Rebecca, we did answer, going back to future TOAs that we talked about, if it was in regulations, that will be a conversation between the entities. But again, just a reminder, it doesn't preclude municipalities from identifying their own TOAs that are not subject to the provincial legislation, which I saw a question in the chat on that. So there's kind of two different parts.
Great, thanks for that, Clarence. So we're down to the last 2 minutes. I can see that quite a few of the remaining questions are actually have been asked and answered already. And that's to be understood because we have multiple people submitting questions within the chat. What I may do is just give the panelists a minute here to see if there's any follow-ups or anything else that they want to respond to. Because we'll be winding down here within the next sort of minute and a half.
There's a question from a participant regarding the prescribed transit stations and will they be updated and removed as applicable? Yes, there will be a process for adding obviously new transit infrastructure as well as removing designated transit facilities when they no longer meet the criteria.
Great, thanks for that, Shannon. Anything else anybody else wants to touch on? We are going to be developing a set of FAQs that we'll put on the website, and we can refer back to the questions that all of you have kindly brought forward to us today. So last chance for any closing comments for panelists before we wrap up here.
I just want to thank everybody. We had like 375 people here today. That's fantastic. I want to thank everybody for coming out. You gave us some great questions. There's more than a few takeaways that we're going to go back and think about and have some discussions. We want to provide useful guidance to the municipalities. We want you to be successful in this. So just a big shout out and thank you for coming today and providing us with such great questions. Really enjoyed it.
Yeah, thanks for that, Teresa. Nice way to wrap up the webinar today, and thanks to all of you for coming out. And I hope if you have yet to make your way home today, that you find safe travels home. And we look forward to connecting with you. We'll be continuing to look at what we need to do to support local governments in the rollout of all of these new initiatives. And we'll be looking at what kind of tools and webinars and supports we can provide. And again, thanks everyone for showing up today. Have a great day.
Thank you.